By 1924, José Raúl Capablanca was not only world champion, he was inevitable. He'd gone 8 years without losing a single game since 1916. Games against him felt like slow, elegant executions. You simply couldn't beat Capablanca. You either survived him or you lost quietly and collected your tears. But then, in that same year, Richard Réti sat across from him in New York and did something the world would never forget. The game begins with Réti playing knight to f3, and already this is unusual. No pawn to e4, no pawn to d4, just a knight. Capablanca responds symmetrically with knight to f6, which is pretty much standard. White plays pawn to c4. At this point, this is the English opening, and it's fundamentally different from what chess looked like in the 1800s. Instead of occupying the center, Réti's controlling it from the side. That c4 pawn will very much be a key pawn that will make some trouble for black if he eventually chooses to play d5. Pawn to g6, preparing to fianchetto the dark-squared bishop. This is the kind of flexible modern setup that was still relatively new at the time. Now Réti plays pawn to b4, and this is the move that probably made Capablanca pause. Pawn to b4 on move 3? What is this? It looks almost reckless. You don't push wing pawns before you've secured the center. That's like chess 101 or something. But Réti's doing it anyway, and he's doing it with purpose. He's going to expand on the queen's side, grab space there, and completely avoid the kind of central pawn battle that Capablanca would dominate. Bishop to g7, bishop to b2, and both players are fianchettoing their bishops now, and you can already feel that this is going to be a different kind of game. These bishops are going to be firing across long diagonals, controlling squares from a distance rather than engaging directly. Black castles kingside, white plays pawn to g3, continuing the fianchetto setup. b6, and white develops with bishop to g2. Black's bishop comes out to b7, then now both sides are castled. We're 7 moves into the game, and if you showed this position to a classical player from the 1800s, they'd probably be confused. Where's the pawn storm? Where's the central tension? Where's the direct confrontation? But that's exactly the point. Réti is playing a completely different game. After white castles and then d6, we can already say that a few light squares have been slightly weakened. At this point, black could have considered a more flexible maneuver, perhaps developing the bishop to f5 later on, or even striving for e5 under better circumstances. That kind of plan, delaying central commitment while preparing a later pawn thrust, would later become a very modern idea, popularized especially by Fischer. You sometimes see plans involving h5 later, coordinating the knight for kingside activity, or even ideas like h4, overprotecting e5. But with the bishop already committed here, those light squares, particularly b7 and c6, are slightly more tender than usual, and that's a direct consequence of the earlier b6 move. White replies with d3, and after knight b to d7, black completes development in a fairly harmonious way. The position looks solid and flexible, with opportunities on both sides. There's a kind of latent tension in the position now, and when black plays e5, we see a faint echo of central occupation. The big question becomes, is this occupation actually premature? Is it exploitable? And if so, how can white hijack the center in response? Theoretically, the pawn chain here could come under pressure, especially with ideas like d4 or c5 lurking, and that's where things get interesting.
White's move queen c2 is very instructive. It vacates d1 for a rook, keeps pressure on black's central ambitions, and also keeps open the possibility of c5 later on, undermining the pawn chain anchored on d6. It's a general-purpose move, flexible, quiet, and very much in the spirit of Réti. After rook e8, black's intentions are clarified somewhat, and white responds with rook fd1. At first glance, this might look odd. Isn't d4 locked down for the moment? And isn't pushing d4 actually discouraged because it would activate black's rook on the e-file? Nevertheless, that clearly is the plan. Réti is preparing d4 regardless. After a5, white wisely refrains from playing b5, which would hand black a beautiful c5 square. Instead, white maintains to pawn on b4, and later supports it with a3, not minding potential rook exchanges. At this point, it's worth briefly checking whether there are historical notes we should already have mentioned, and indeed, there are. In 1922, Richard Réti published Die neuen Ideen im Schachspiel, translated into English in 1923 as Modern Ideas in Chess. This book examined the evolution of chess ideas, linking older classical concepts to the emerging modern school. Nimzovich's My System followed later, published between 1925 and 1927 in 5 installments, and while it introduced hypermodern concepts, it was largely a positional treatise. Réti, meanwhile, was one of the strongest players in the world during the 1910s and 1920s. Early in his career, he played in a very classical, even romantic style, using openings like the King's Gambit, but after World War I, his approach changed radically. His literary contributions, including Masters of the Chessboard, were hugely influential, arguably second only to Nimzovich's in shaping modern thought. The result of this game, in particular, gave enormous credibility to hypermodern ideas. Nimzovich himself had a poor score against Capablanca, a handful of draws and 5 or 6 losses, some of them crushing positional defeats. Capablanca even used Nimzovich's own ideas against him. So here we have the reigning world champion confronted with something genuinely unfamiliar, a double fianchetto setup, with white deliberately not occupying the center with pawns on d4 or e4. One could argue that this unfamiliarity forced Capablanca into a degree of improvisation, and that this led to a subtle but significant error, one that would later snowball into more remembered mistakes. The move h6 is that first subtle misstep. It doesn't actively help Black's position. While it prevents an immediate knight g5, it's a permanent weakening move, a commitment that can never be undone. Meanwhile, White continues with knight f1, a very characteristic Réti maneuver that appears in several of his games. The knight prepares to reroute centrally, often via e3. Black responds with c5, seemingly locking down d4. With a rook staring down the e-file, Capablanca is essentially saying, "You're never getting d4." Yet White calmly proceeds anyway, first with b5, ensuring that the knight cannot hop into c5. After knight f8, we ask where that knight is even going. White's plan remains crystal clear: d4 is coming. After queen c7, Capablanca signals that if White ever does play d4, the c4 pawn will be targeted. That makes d4 look unpalatable, yet White plays it anyway. Following bishop e4, the queen is attacked, but Réti responds with queen c3, calmly sidestepping and keeping everything intact. Then Capablanca opens the e-file with e takes d4, but there are no targets there. After recapturing, knight d7 pins the pawn to the queen, forcing queen d2, which now also offers c4 as a temporary pawn sacrifice.
This moment radically transforms the position. What was once a closed center becomes a completely open one within just a few moves. After c takes d4 and bishop takes d4, Capablanca takes on c4. And then comes bishop sacrifice on g7, forcing king takes g7. This check is crucial. It exposes the king, gains a tempo, and allows White to defend b5, which in turn makes rook takes d6 possible. Material balance is restored, but the center has been blown to smithereens. So why is White better here? First, White already has pressure on d6 and d7. Black's pieces are tied down. The d-file becomes a highway, not theoretical, but practical. The rooks can infiltrate, switch directions, and create threats everywhere. Second, White's knights are simply superior. One is already ideally placed. The other is heading toward e3, while Black's knights are frozen. The queen, too, shines on its diagonal, while Black's queen struggles to find a safe square. After queen c5, rook d1 increases pressure again. Black is forced into awkward defense. a7 looks sickly. The knights cannot move. Light squares are chronically weak. Knight e3 is coming, and with it ideas like knight d5, knight c6, and rook d3. When Capablanca plays h5, it feels artificial, a move we're simply not used to seeing in his games. It creates threats, yes, but also more weaknesses. Engine analysis reveals that White actually missed a knockout blow here, rook d5, which would have effectively trapped the queen. Even so, knight d4 maintains a crushing position. After bishop takes g2, a sacrifice, and king takes g2, Black again resorts to an artificial pin with queen e5, easily repulsed. Then knight c4, queen c5, knight c6, and suddenly the rook is driven to c7. Knight e3 follows, and White's pieces dominate the center completely.
After knight e5, lateral pressure decides the game. Rook d5 wins material outright. The queen has no escape. With knight c6 cutting off retreat squares, the queen is effectively trapped. The threat is real, concrete, and decisive. And so, José Raúl Capablanca, the unbeatable world champion, resigned. Now, it may have seemed like Black resigned prematurely here. I mean, you could say there was knight c4, so if the rook takes, we take the queen. But frankly, even with the trades, White still has way more initiative here, and Capablanca realized that and decided it just wasn't worth the hassle. But here's the tragic part. Réti died in 1929, just 5 years after this game. He was only 40 years old. Scarlet fever took him before he could fully develop his ideas, before he could challenge for the world championship, before the world could fully appreciate what he'd contributed to chess. And yet, his influence outlasted many world champions. His ideas are in every modern opening. His concepts are taught to beginners and grandmasters alike. He changed chess forever, and he did it not by playing more accurately than everyone else, but by thinking differently. If you got value from this video, please support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. I'll be covering even more games that changed chess history in the future. Thank you for doing that, and I'll see you in the next one.